All right, so we're talking about the freed slaves in the North, South, and London and their experiences, respectively. Next slide, please. Okay, to begin, we're talking about the opportunities in the North. Okay, so the North was a hotspot for Black people escaping slavery and all people that were already freed. They just presented a multitude of opportunities for freed African Americans that they wouldn't necessarily have in the South. They could follow trades such as being barbers, carpenters, painters, shoemakers, and the majority of freed Blacks lived in segregated communities in the larger cities because they were industry hotspots and they provided the most opportunities for places to work. Little tidbit about how the Black communities worked. Basically, the center of them was the Black church, and in the picture, that's one of the first Black Baptist churches in America. They served as like the hearts of the community. They functioned as schools. They held community meetings and even harbored fugitive slaves that were running away. And as well as that, they presented both Black men and women with opportunities to enrich their education and to find work as preachers and pastors. And yeah, they were pretty inclusive towards women. So then overall, freed Blacks in the North, as of 1860, there was 476,000 free Blacks in the United States. 221,000 of them lived in the North at that time. And so the social climate was a lot less racist and more welcoming to Black people than in the South. But there was still heavy discrimination and racist laws in place. That being said, though, in a contemporary sense, the North was indeed a lot more progressive, and many states allowed free Black people to vote. And in the graphic right here, it just shows like a little list of states with male suffrage. You know, a majority of the New England states did allow Blacks to vote. And then I thought it was a good example of the actual, like, the racism that they saw, because they did have rights, but then you can see that many states are restricted, and that's because they had a property value requirement. So like in New York, it says it's restricted. It's because they required a $250 property value for you to be able to vote. So like actually only 100 Black people in New York could vote, although they did have the right technically. And then I wanted to talk about the Fugitive Slave Act because it came up in Jacob's narrative, and it really impacted slaves in the North. So it was passed in Congress in 1850, and it required that all escaped slaves were to be returned to their masters upon capture. And it made officials and citizens legally obligated to cooperate with people trying to capture these slaves. And so that the act, wait, hold on, I'm going to talk about it a little more. Okay. So the act, it spurred on already increasing polarization between North and South. And so it kind of was one of the causes of the Civil War. And for freed slaves, it made the threat of recapture extremely dire. So these people had already escaped slavery, and they were living in freedom relatively in the North. And then all of a sudden they had the Fugitive Slave Act because of this Compromise Act, and it made the threat of recapture so much more imminent. And Jacobs actually talks about that in the novel. And finally, many northern states actually did eventually put forth legislature that basically negated the Fugitive Slave Act and allowed freed slaves to, find asylum in the North.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about successful African Americans in the 19th century. Like Ethan said, about half of African Americans that were freed moved to the North. A lot of them stayed South, and some of them stayed in the Midwest too. Besides the book, I also looked into The Bone and Sinew of the Land by Annalisa Cox. She's a historian at Wisconsin. I recommend you guys look her up. She wrote a lot of good stuff. Anyways, a lot of Midwestern states and the South required a $500 fee and 2 white alibis to provide their independence. $500 is a lot more than it sounds. It kind of translates to about 5,000 today, maybe a bit more. A lot of them went back to indentured servitude, which is a technical term for the closest thing a white man could get to a slave besides slavery. As I said, despite all the hardships African Americans faced during the 19th century, some prevailed to success amid the hostile land. So I'm talking about essentially rich people that made it outside of slavery. John Langston. John Langston was also a poet in the 1900s. It's a different guy. This guy was the first person to be elected office as an African American. He was just a town clerk, which isn't a big deal. But and at the time when people voted for him, both whites and blacks, they actually didn't know that he was the first black man to be elected in office, which in my opinion kind of made him win. It's because it was more low key. And a lot of people moved to the north for the more progressive states, and the South was known as a segregated land. But I feel like the fact that it was Ohio is a very low key town. People didn't really care much about whether or not he was black or white. They just really needed a town clerk. Yeah, that's John Langston. This is the Union Literary Institute. It's in the middle of Indiana. It was a really special school because not only was it for girls and boys, it was also biracial. The guy that ran it was a black man. He unfortunately doesn't have a name. A lot of these people didn't have names because people didn't think it was a really cherishable piece of history, which is kind of sad. But it still stands to this day, and it's kind of not being preserved, which is a shame. But it really was a piece of history in Indiana. So the point being, in the 1840s, the largest mill owner in Indiana was African American. He was later threatened and shot by competing mill owners. They then lost him in a skilled mill. Lots of jobs were lost because of that. And this is my thesis statement. In the bottom it says, racism arose in the face of African American success, not African American failure. It really just means people were starting to realize that African Americans were really just people, and they were kind of threatened by that, which I think is why racism even exists. But yeah, on to Mitchell. Thank you.
All right, moving on from North and South, we're going to go over to Britain and see what life was like for freed slaves over there. So in the year 1807, the slave trade was abolished, but it wasn't until the year 1834 that slavery was officially banned. After slavery ended, many blacks created their own social, political, and domestic life. A good portion of them lived in the same buildings as whites and drank and played music in the same bars and brothels. A few of them even became rather famous. There was one freed slave whose name was Peter Jackson. He was a boxer, and he was infamous and called the Black Prince. London also allowed blacks to own their own property and publicly hold church, which was things that were not fully allowed in America for many years. One of the most famous of all the freed slaves in Britain was Ignatius Sancho, who was born on a slave ship and lost both of his parents by the age of 2. He was friends with many famous figures in Britain at the time, owned a corner shop, and was penned the first British black author to have their own work published. While many freed slaves thrived in London after the abolition of slavery, thousands were stuck in indentured servitude. Multiple stories and sources that I read show that some free slaves became servants to wealthy white families, where their job would be stand in a corner and look as if they were painting or a piece of art. Well, many times their boss would buy a collar with their name on it as to show kind of like, this is my pet kind of, which is really sad knowing that even after slavery ended, there was basically slavery still going on in the form of indentured servitude. Another unfortunate event was in Britain, a lot of the minorities, they decided to send them over to a colony of Sierra Leone. I think it was around 800 free black slaves were on the boats there. And when they arrived, almost all of them were killed within a year from just disease and famine, just all these terrible things. And after more and more slaves became free, their populations started to thrive. A lot of them took up the arms and joined Napoleon and helped him in his wars. And after the wars ended, they all went to London and settled. By the end of the 1800s, there was over 3 million freed blacks living in London and all around England. And after that, it continued to surge. And that is the end of our presentation. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot about freed blacks.